Deplatforming, demands to speak about the vaccine only in state-approved ways, government censorship, all of this is on the rise. Rachel Bovard is the Senior Director of Policy for the Conservative Partnership Institute, and she joins us now. Rachel, welcome. Good to see you. And I think that you had a piece recently, and I have it linked on here, I think you had it at the American Conservatives, where you finally convinced me, your piece convinced me on the whole antitrust. I had some remaining questions, and you answered all of my remaining questions, which I'm going to touch on here in a minute. But this is the larger question that I keep coming back to, especially whenever I hear Jen Psaki talk about misinformation. If you have a group of scientists and doctors on one side and they have, their theories, and you have another group of scientists and doctors on the other side and they have their theories, who gets to determine what is misinformation and what isn't? Who picks the science that we go with?
Well, that's the big question with misinformation, because at the end of the day, whatever constitutes misinformation, the needs of the powerful decide that. Whoever's in charge decides what misinformation is. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the White House try to use the biggest speech platforms in the world under the guise of misinformation to control what is said. And not just on the platform, but in private messages, in text messages. They want to control it all the way down, not just about vaccines, but also about anything that goes against what they call the narrative about COVID-19. So this is a very, very concerning development in my mind, because you're seeing corporate power fuse with state power in really troubling ways.
Yeah, and that's just it. I think the big hurdle for a lot of conservatives and a lot of Republicans for so long was they want to respect private business rights, et cetera. But at the same time, as you just mentioned, when you have the federal government that is really colluding or conspiring really with these companies, then it ceases to be a private business operating in its, the way that it wants. It's not really that issue anymore. And then that's when the whole idea of antitrust comes in. Do you think the conservatives are kind of now, with all of this, shifting their perspective on that?
You definitely do see some conservatives now coming down on the side of, break up these companies, but no one's really sure how to do it. The left has some very good ideas that they say they're good ideas that I am a little skeptical of, because again, you see the White House right now not necessarily wanting to break up big tech. They want to use that power for themselves. They recognize these platforms as essential speech platforms. They know that narrative control is the first step to controlling a policy outcome. They want to use that power for themselves. So what does breakup actually look like, I think, is at the end of the day something the right has to get their heads around, because, antitrust, and I make this point in the piece, antitrust is not regulatory, it's law enforcement. If these companies have been found in the course of due process to be acting in uncompetitive ways, that goes against our laws, and they should be punished for that. So you see the Department of Justice under President Trump bring a lawsuit against Google alleging these anti-competitive acts. Now that's still working its way through the courts, but it could, at the end of the day, result in some lines of business being separated from Google, because at the end of the day, my biggest concern is the scale at which these companies operate. If Google controls information for only 30% of the world, as opposed to the 90% of the world they do now, it's much easier to co-opt them. It's much easier to wipe out sort of independent thought in America. So breaking the scale of these companies, in my mind, is the first step toward being able to actually compete a lot of these speech concerns away.
Yeah, and you touch on, Rachel, you touch on in your the pieces that you've written about this, just the big chunks. And I was actually surprised to see how much, like for instance, Amazon and particularly book sales and to Google, et cetera, how much of the market they really do commandeer. And you brought up a really good point too, as it relates to some of the earlier antitrust action with, for instance, Microsoft, because Microsoft, this whole thing had to be done with Microsoft. And from that, and I had not realized, I knew it, but I hadn't really realized what the impact that this had. That's how we got Google, because Microsoft, they busted Microsoft, and then they allowed other entities to be able to compete and use the internet to reach Microsoft customers. A lot of people, and especially I think maybe younger millennials and definitely Gen Z, they're a generation removed from that. They're not entirely familiar with seeing that actually have worked out and how the impact that it has.
Yeah, that's right. Antitrust is designed to make sure the market's actually working. And I think so much of our conversation misses that point when we talk about antitrust. It's designed to make sure that competitors are actually competing on the merits and not because, they've maintained this uncompetitive dominance over certain sectors. So to your point, because of the Microsoft suit, because they lost that antitrust lawsuit, they really were separated from the browser market. And that allowed a really cool website called Google to develop, and a host of other innovations to take place in this space. And so I think we've reached the point with some of these tech platforms where we're in the same place that Microsoft was, where they're just so dominant that you don't even have small competitors being able to make a stand, or if they are there, their only exit strategy is to be bought by one of these big platforms. And so you have to ask yourself, is there some uncompetitive action going on here? And that's what antitrust is designed to investigate.
Yeah, and also I think, when people were talking about the digital public square previously before the lockdown and the pandemic, everything else, and it was kind of, focused on some, just free speech, and of course people were disagreeing on policy, but then we saw how that control and that intent to dominate all the discussion with one approved narrative, how the impact that has had on health, and also people's their faith in their government institutions to listen to them about things like vaccines. And so do you think that it's at the point, even if we have the government, as you said, this is law enforcement, which is a great point, and not regulatory, it's law enforcement, are we so far in having ceded the public square digitally to these big tech companies that there's really, where are we with that? Can we really actually kind of claw some of that back?
This is, I think, the struggle for the right in particular for the next decade is kind of assessing our policy response to this, because in my mind, antitrust is step one, but it's definitely not enough, because innovation, our public policy chases innovation in a lot of ways, and it definitely is in this space, because you're not just seeing sort of the massive economic dominance of these platforms, but these are also market access platforms. These are also massive data companies. They now control vast swaths of the economy far outside of speech. And so I think for the right, it's determining how we want to live in relation to companies that can now track us in unprecedented ways, that now, package and repackage our data, that can follow us all over the world, that know what we're saying in our homes. So all of these are elements of what I think has to be a robust policy conversation, because to your point, we've really moved in the last 15, 20 years from a physical world to a digital one. We're now living online and in a largely lawless space. Our policy hasn't kept up. So this is going to require a lot of solutions that I think we're really only starting to grapple with now.